What up, though? Oxford English Dictionary. Pilgrim, stranger, alien, pilgrim, crusader. Again, Oxford English Dictionary. Pilgrim, stranger, alien, pilgrim, crusader. Pilgrim, a person on a journey, a person who travels from place to place, a traveler, a wanderer, an itinerant. Also in early use, a foreigner, an alien, a stranger, now literary and poetic. So it says a person on a journey. So let's cut over. This is still Oxford English Dictionary. A person on a journey, a stranger, a alien was the definition of a pilgrim. So a person on a journey seems easy enough. Are you a person? Let's see what person means. A role or character assumed in real life or in a play, etc. A part, function, or office. A persona, a semblance, or guise. Hence, any of the characters in a play or story. Again, let's go over this one more time and then we'll move along. A pilgrim, a person on a journey, a person who travels from place to place, a traveler, a wanderer, an itinerant, also in early use, a foreigner, an alien, a stranger, a person on a journey. A role, this is the definition of person, a role or character assumed in real life. A role or character assumed in real life. Again, I ask, are you a person? Person, a person who makes a journey. This is pilgrim again. A person who makes a journey, usually of a long distance. You've heard of pilgrims, right? Right? The pilgrims are the people who you say enslaved your ancestors, right? Well, not you in particular, but you've heard of this, right? Be honest. So, pilgrims, the early people who came here, the foreigners who came here, the persons who got you calling yourself a person now. I know it's difficult. I know it's difficult to not call yourself a person. That's all you know. That's all I knew. A person, this is a pilgrim, another definition of pilgrim, or an extension to the definition. They all mean the same thing. A person who makes a journey, usually of a long distance, to a sacred place as an act of religious devotion to a sacred place. The pilgrims were coming to a sacred place, America, your home, your people's homeland. Your people, the Americans, the real Americans, the only ones there ever was, is, and will be. The pilgrims were making a journey of a long distance to a sacred place. Some called America Eden, right? Rightfully so. It's beautiful, right? Your spot beautiful. In extended use, a person who makes a journey to visit a place of particular significance or interest as an act of homage, respect. I don't know how much that definition fits. However, it is a definition. U.S. history. This is from 1630, roughly, usually in plural and with capital initial. Any of the English Puritans who founded the colony of Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. Any of the other early English colonists. See, Pilgrim Fathers. Think about that. Any of the English Puritans who founded the colony of Plymouth. Remember, it's a speech people always play from Malcolm X where he says, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock landed on us." Now, I've heard people play different parts of Malcolm X's speeches where he's speaking of what the definition of Aborigine and speaking of the American Negro and we are Aborigines and all this other kind of stuff. Well, there's more to those speeches. Some people take those speeches out of context. It's okay. I get the point. We all get the point. No one has to walk us through it step by step at this point. They shouldn't have to. However, I'm just saying Malcolm X just so you can remember he did say that we didn't land on Plymouth Rock, the rock landed on us. Now, I don't know what he meant. He referred to Africa and Negro and things like that a lot. So I really don't know where he stood at that particular point in time. I mean, he was with the Nation of Islam, so he was Muslim. So he wasn't necessarily speaking of genealogy and things of this nature. But I mean, the fact that he said we didn't land on Plymouth Rock, the rock landed on us, that's quite true. It says any of the English Puritans who founded the colony of Plymouth. Now, they didn't found the place called that they termed as Plymouth, Massachusetts. The soil was already there in 1620. They spot Plymouth, right? But anyway, in 1620. Now, remember, in 1619, it is said that's when your people first got here. And I always make reference to 1619 because it's important, because it's an entire business today. It's a big machine, 1619. It's a huge piece of propaganda. It said your people got here in 1619. Your ancestors, not your, well, And there's people who look like us today, and they will say that their people got here as slaves. They came off the slave ships through the transatlantic slave trade. Yes. Well, they're speaking of 1619. That's when the so-called first Africans got here. And that is false. And when you think about it, any of the English Puritans who founded the colony of Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, does it make sense? Of course it doesn't make sense. We've been over that many times. Pilgrims, North American regional, chiefly Western, and colloquial, frequently depreciative. A recent immigrant, a tenderfoot of cattle, a newly imported or unseasoned animal, now chiefly in weakened sense, a newcomer, a stranger. Encyclopedia.com. European migrations to American colonies, 1492 through 1820. We just heard about the Puritans, the Pilgrims, who got here, and it says to Plymouth in 1620, right? So European migrations to American colonies 1492 through 1820. In the 3 centuries following the voyages of Christopher Columbus to the Americas, the world was transformed by a massive transoceanic movement of peoples, the largest in human history up to that time. It says transoceanic. See the wordplay? The migration of several million Europeans to the Americas during this period was fundamental to the formation of the New World Society. European settlement and diseases devastated indigenous populations and led to a scramble for lands on a continental scale that resulted in a checkerboard of Euro-American societies from the Hudson Bay in northern Canada to Tierra del Fuego, an island group of the southern tip of South America. From the Atlantic ports of Europe, principally of Britain, Spain, and Portugal, wave after wave of settlers, rich and poor, took ships seeking their fortune beyond the seas. Now, from 1492 to 1820, millions of foreigners, of pilgrims, of settlers migrated here from Europe to the Americas. Tell me, where do these people have time to go get tens of millions of so-called of people from the place that is termed, quote, Africa, end quote? Where did they have time for this? Where did they have resources? Just doesn't make sense, but I'm not here to prove that today. Between 1492 and 1820, approximately 2.6 million Europeans immigrated to the Americas. Listen, okay? Because we know that large waves of Europeans came through Ellis Island in the late 1800s, the mid to late 1800s. Early 1900s. If you ask a lot of people who come from that soil portion that is termed Europe, who are in America today, they'll tell you that their people got here in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Of course, there are those who came during this time of 1492 through 1820, of course. As we see, 2.6 million Europeans immigrated to the Americas. That's from 1492 to 1820. Then from the mid 1800s up until today, we have been bombarded by pilgrims. And they say we can't get right. How we supposed to get right if they steady stacking they people over here? Huh? And you made to believe that you the problem. Right? The second phase, lasting from 1640 to 1760, saw a threefold increase in numbers of immigrants. During this period, 1.3 million settlers left Europe for the New World. Many of the British, French, Swiss, and German settlers who immigrated during this period arrived under labor contracts that typically obliged them to work between 4 and 7 years in return for the cost of their passage, board, and lodging, and certain payments called freedom dues. Okay? Called freedom dues. Open your mind. Let's not think about all the things you've been taught so far. Open your mind. Okay? Let's learn something new together. So, British, French, Swiss, and German settlers who immigrated during this period arrived under labor contracts that typically obliged them to work between 4 and 7 years in return for the cost of their passage, their bus fare, board, and lodging. And certain payments called freedom dues. Freedom dues were made by the master to the servant on completion of the term of service. See, listen, the master is the manager. The servant is the employee. Okay? When you hear master and slave, servant and employee, boss and employee, you get all hot and bothered when you hear master and slave. But yet you hear it so much today: boss, manager, supervisor, employee, worker, laborer. You hear it so much today. But to call it a manager, supervisor, to call you an employee, take the sting off of it, right? Rightfully so. Which typically took the form of provisions, clothing, tools, rights to land, money, or a small share of the crop, tobacco or sugar. The final phase of each modern immigration from 1760 to 1820 was once again dominated by free settlers and witnessed an enormous surge of British migrants to North America. These British migrants made up more than 70% of all immigrants who crossed the Atlantic in these years. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the 1400s and 1500s, the decision by Spanish and Portuguese monarchs to take possession of the New World and establish colonies governed by the crown required the transfer of large settler populations. The peopling of the Americas, in other words. In Spanish and British America alike, plantation colonies absorbed the great majority of white and black enslaved immigrants. Okay? In Spanish and British America alike, plantation colonies absorbed the great majority of white and black enslaved immigrants. Now, when they say white and black, okay, we're not talking about the Crayola crayon box. We're talking about human beings here, okay? I'm going to leave it at that. Most of the 350,000 English migrants who crossed the Atlantic during the 17th, 1600s, 17th century, for example, ended up in the West Indies. 180,000, and Chesapeake 120,000. Only about 23,000 settlers made their way to the American middle colonies and 21,000 to New England. English immigration represented the transfer of a massive labor force to America. You hear that? Now, why would they go and get 10, 12, 100 million so-called Africans from Africa when the English immigration represented the transfer of a massive labor force to America, which was essential for the development of staple agriculture, sugar and tobacco in the West Indies and Chesapeake, right? Whether free or unfree, immigration from Europe to America was intensely regional. During the 16th and first half of the 17th centuries, the origins of Spanish immigrants were heavily skewed toward the Southwest. Andalusia alone contributed between 1/3 and 1/2 of all migrants to Spain. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, Andalusia alone contributed. Remember, they're talking about Southwest Spain. Andalusia alone contributed between 1/3 and 1/2 of all migrants from Spain to the Americas. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, the character of Spanish immigration changed dramatically. Now, mind you, when you're speaking of Spain, you're not speaking of people who you're not just speaking of people who you may term as white. You are speaking also, you should also be understanding that these are people who you would consider black. People who are brown skinned, all shades of brown. Okay? In the late 17th and 18th centuries, the character of Spanish immigration changed dramatically, with far higher numbers of people moving from the poorer provinces of the North Coast, the East, and from the Balearic and Canary Islands. Roderick Gordon, a Scot who immigrated to Virginia, confided to his brother in 1734, "A pity it is that thousands of my country people should stay starving at home when they may live here in peace and plenty, as a great many who have been transported for a punishment have found pleasure, profit, and ease, and would rather undergo any hardship than be forced back to their own country." America was described by one settler as a paradise where newcomers had naught to do but pluck and eat. And it holds true for today. You know, with the people continuing to come here and, for lack of a better term, take your stuff. Take our stuff. Take our people's stuff. British convicts shipped to American colonies. In 1769, Dr. Johnson, speaking of Americans, said to a friend, "Sir, they are a race of convicts and ought to be content with anything we may allow them short of hanging." When they speak of Americans right there, they're speaking of pilgrims. Because as you know, when they got here, all of a sudden, when people land on our shores, all of a sudden, they're Americans. Which means anyone who was here on the American soil before any of these people got here are eclipsed. So let's not forget, this is why your name is so important. This is why what your people called you is so important. So when you got a name and you running around saying that that's a slave master name, the slave master gave my people that name, just understand something. When these pilgrims came here from all these places that we just went over, do you think somebody was coming from Germany, was coming from Spain, was coming from Andalusia? Do you think these people was coming here and their name was Leroy Johnson? Huh? Man, let's shake it. In the latest edition of Boswell, who chronicled this saying, it is explained by the following footnote: convicts were sent to 9 of the American settlements. According to one estimate, about 2,000 had been sent for many years annually. And the first saying was in 1769, when Dr. Johnson, speaking of Americans, said to a friend, "Sir, they are a race of convicts." He's speaking of pilgrims. Foreigners is who he's speaking of. What they would term today as illegal aliens, right? These English views of the United States in the colonial period as penal settlements and convict establishment move incredulity and indignation in Americans. These English views of the United States, okay, see how they say the United States, that's what we're really talking about here, the United Colonies, in the colonial period as penal settlements and convict establishments move incredulity and indignation in Americans, with whom Plymouth stands for a colony of conscience, Massachusetts for an asylum of martyrs, and Virginia for the old dominion of hybrid cavaliers. See, these people take ownership of your stuff, of our stuff. Look how easy it is for them to just claim it. They're actually committing identity theft, and they're doing it with pride, right? But a student who would nothing extenuate nor set down aught in malice is bound to ascertain how far a convict element really pervaded our early plantations. In this research, he will find little help from our standard histories. Bancroft in 1887, conversing with the present writer, freely admitted that when speaking of felons among our settlers, he had been very economical in dispensing the truths he had discovered. Writing of the early Virginians, he said, some of them were even convicts, but it must be remembered the crimes of which they were convicted were chiefly political. It seems certain that among the felons sent to New England, by far the largest element was made up of prisoners taken in battle. A letter from Reverend John Cotton to Cromwell, dated Boston, July 28, 1651, states that sundry Scottish Scots taken by him at Dunbar, September 2nd, 1650, had arrived there and been sold, not for slaves to perpetual servitude, but for 6 or 7 or 8 years, etc. That the word sundry meant 150, we learn from the British Calendar Domestic Series for 1650. On September 19th, the Council of State ordered 150 Scotch prisoners delivered to be sent to New England by John Foote. On October 23rd, it was ordered that they be shipped away forthwith, and on November 11th, that they be delivered to Augustus Walker, master of the Unity, for transportation to New England. In 1650, Dr. Stone, a Massachusetts agent, bought several Scotch prisoners from Tothill Jail, London. Again, of the prisoners taken at Worcester, September 3rd, 1651, 272 were shipped to New England on the John and Sarah from London and arrived in Boston the following spring. Their names, derived from the Hutchinson Papers, were printed in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. The number deported to Virginia from among the Scotch made prisoners at the Battle of Worcester was much smaller than is generally stated. Thus, in Ball's White Servitude in the Colony of Virginia, a recent issue of the Johns Hopkins Press, we read of the Scotch prisoners taken at the Battle of Worcester, 1610, were sent to Virginia in 1651. No question regarding convicts shipped to America is so hard to answer as that which relates to the particular colony in which each gang of them was put ashore. Mention of Virginia, Maryland, and Jamaica or Barbados is not infrequent, but I could find no notice of any single transport landed in New England except the Scotch and Irish of whom I have spoken. When I wrote to notes and queries asking for the names of such a New England convict, the name Elizabeth Canning was given me. Concerning Elizabeth Canning, the notice in the Gentleman's Magazine is this: 1754, July 28th, Elizabeth Canning is ordered to be transported to some of His Majesty's American colonies and has been delivered to the merchant who contracted with the court to be transported accordingly. And 'tis certain that in case she be found at large in the kingdom before the expiration of 7 years, she will be liable to the pains of death. There is here no evidence that Elizabeth Canning was shipped to New England rather than to some other American plantation. In a later volume, however, of the Gentleman's Magazine, it is stated that she died at Wethersfield in Connecticut in the year 1773 after having been married to a person of the name of Treat, or some name sounding like that. It is added that notice of her death appeared in 1773 in Say's Weekly Journal. Writing once more to notes and queries in order to ascertain the name of the vessel in which Elizabeth Canning was transported, I received the following answer: if we can take the London journals of 1754 to have been correctly informed, the name of the vessel in which Elizabeth Canning had her passage was the Matilda, Captain Button, which cleared from Deal August 26, and her destination was Philadelphia. The names of 19 others who were sentenced to transportation at the same time with her were also furnished. That's interesting. It says the name of 19 others who were sentenced to transportation. Transportation in this text meaning taking someone, I guess, from London to one of the American colonies, from a London jail to one of the American colonies, or as they called them earlier, penal colonies. But transportation, not just meaning I guess it is meaning that going from one place to another. Now it means something a little different. It just means the act of going from one place to another. In this context, it means more. The names of 19 others who were sentenced to transportation at the same time with her were also furnished, but it still seems odd that a transport who was to be landed in New England should be put on board a vessel bound for Philadelphia. No doubt this vessel's homeward voyage was by way of New England. Oxford Bibliographies. Indentured Servitude. Michael Guasco. Although it most famously appeared during the 17th century as a means for facilitating transatlantic migration and providing labor in England's early American colonies, indentured servitude has manifested itself in many forms during its long history. Indentured servants were individuals who bargained away their labor for a period of 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to the New World. Does this sound familiar to anyone? I'm talking to you. Does this sound familiar? Let's just say over the past 5 or 6 years, right? Let's say 5, 6, 7 years. And much earlier, but the last 5 or 6 years, it's been like Breaking news, these people are coming from this place, okay? And they're bargaining away their labor for a period of time, indefinitely, really. Because when someone puts a microphone and a camera in one of said people's faces, what do they say? They say, we just want to work, right? For a period of 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to the New World. In the 17th century, indentured servants made up the mass of English immigrants to Chesapeake colonies. Large numbers of indentured servants could also be found in the English West Indian colonies. In the 17th century, most indentured servants were of English origin and migrated to the Chesapeake and West Indies. In the 17th century, okay? We're talking the 1600s. The 1600s. From 1600 to 1699 is when we're speaking of. This is supposed to be the time when they say your people got here in order to be slaves, in order to provide free slave labor indefinitely, chattel slavery for life, right? But yet, in the 17th century, most indentured servants were of English origin and migrated to the Chesapeake and West Indies. Of course, 120,000 immigrants to the Chesapeake during this era. Roughly 90,000 arrived as bound laborers. Henry Louis Gates says tracing your roots or find your roots or whatever his show is called. At one point on his website or Slave Voyages or something of the sort, named millions, named hundreds of thousands of people arrived in America as slaves. And he later changed that number from hundreds of thousands coming to the American mainland to roughly about 92,000. And here we see of the 120,000 immigrants to the Chesapeake during this era, roughly 90,000 arrived as bound laborers. Bound laborers mean they were bound to a contract, right? Then we just read that. And it says immigrant with an E. We're talking about Chesapeake and West Indies. Immigrants with an E, meaning it's probably within the Americas. Another 50,000 to 75,000 white indentured servants went to the islands, although these numbers include many Irish servants, political prisoners, and convict laborers. Get out of that as you please. I'm not going to go. This is not the show for me to go over these word games they play. Okay, I'll go over it a tad bit. Arrived. It says, of the 120,000 immigrants to the Chesapeake during this era, roughly 90,000 arrived as bound laborers. Okay, another 50,000 to 75,000 white indentured servants. See, up here it says most indentured servants were of English origin and migrated to the Chesapeake and West Indies. It seems like I'm repeating this stuff. It seems like this is deja vu. Like I've already went over this. I'm sure I have. I wouldn't be shocked. If I've said If I've did this entire show before the exact same way and said it the exact same way, this is deja vu. Just so happens right now we need a little deja vu because the propaganda is unbalanced. In the 17th century, most indentured servants were of English origin and migrated to the Chesapeake and West Indies. The West Indies, we'll see what the West Indies consisted of, okay? But most of them were of English origin. They migrated to the Chesapeake and West Indies. Of English origin, England, from England, Anglo-Saxons. Of the 120,000 immigrants to the Chesapeake during this era, okay, roughly 90,000 arrived as bound laborers. So immigrants, we're talking about within the Americas. Yes? If I'm wrong, but E on the front of it suggests that it's within. Okay. Arrived as bound laborers. 90,000, roughly 90,000 out of the 120 were bound by contracts. Okay. Another 50,000 to 75,000 white, make sure they said white indentured servants went to the islands, although these numbers included many Irish, suggesting that the Irish weren't considered white, right? Political prisoners and convict laborers. Or, yeah, maybe for a good reason. Either were the Irish, were they not all the complexion that you term as the people who we call white today? Were they gingers or, excuse me, I know the hard ER. Let's say gingers. Were they gingers? Did they look like you? Perhaps? Not, I don't know. Library of Congress. We were just speaking of the West Indies. Library of Congress, okay? That's where we're at right now. Library of Congress. The West Indies, including part of Virginia, North Carolina, East Florida, South Carolina, West Florida. Now, mind you, at this time when they're speaking of this, West Florida included parts of Alabama and Mississippi as well. Okay. Georgia, Louisiana, and the Gulf of Mexico, with part of the coast of South America from the Bay of Honduras to the mouth of the river Orinoco, from the latest and best authorities and actual observations. Now that we've cleared that up, and this is from 1783. Here we go again. The Library of Congress, U.S. History Primary Source Timeline. Immigration to the United States, 1851 through 1900. Remember, earlier we spoke of 1492 to 1820, right? I told you, waves and waves of pilgrims, of foreigners are coming here. Why? Have you ever thought to yourself, why? Many of their ascendants, I forgot what you call people who are here today. Many of these people will tell you they came for better opportunities for work, to get out of political or religious persecution and things of this nature. I get it. All of these things are fine, but what does that do to you and your people? What does that do to me and my people? Where does that leave us? It's like going from rural Alabama to the Henry Horner Projects in Chicago. The Henry Horner Projects in maybe 83. Let's just say in 83 or 85 or something like that. Not today. It's a different world now. Remember, we spoke of earlier of the large immigration, 1492 through 1820. Right now, U.S. history primary source timeline immigration to the United States, 1851 through 1900. And remember, I mentioned the mid 1800s to the late 1800s, early 1900s is when waves came. In the late 1800s, people in many parts of the world decided to leave their homes and immigrate to the United States. Why? Who told them to? Think about that. Who told them, people? And it's not so easy for someone to pack up their people and leave their homeland to go somewhere else, completely go somewhere else. I'm not talking about going from Louisiana to California. I'm talking about going from somewhere across large bodies of water. Somewhere where, see, going from Louisiana to California is, sure, the people are different, but niggas in America, we all got that thing in common where we understand one another. In the late 1800s, people in many parts of the world decided to leave their homes and immigrate to the United States, fleeing crop failure, land and job shortages, rising taxes and famine. Many came to the U.S. because it was perceived as the land of economic opportunity, or paradise, remember, or the Garden of Eden. I'm not talking about biblical stuff. I'm just saying the Garden of Eden, it's a nice phrase to describe paradise. Smell me? And nearly 12 million immigrants arrived in the United States between 1870 and 1900. Now, 12 million is a significant number, because for a long time you were told 12.5 million Africans were stolen, locked under a boat like sardines, went through the Middle Passage, went through the disgusting, despicable Middle Passage, landed on the shores of America, and were used as chattel slavery and treated worse than animals. And we're told that we are here as a result of those people, and those people are our ancestors. And guess what? It's a lot of people that believe that today. Remember, they tell you the number is 12.5 million. And right here, I'm saying, from the Library of Congress, U.S. History Primary Source Timeline, Immigration to the United States, 1851 through 1900, I'm saying nearly 12 million immigrants arrived in the United States between 1870 and 1900. Let's shake it. During the 1870s and 1880s, the vast majority of these people were from Germany, Ireland, and England. The principal source of a relatively large group of Chinese immigrated, a relatively large group of Chinese immigrated to the United States between the start of the California Gold Rush in 1849 and 1882. Chinese we talking about now. Okay. Immigrants entered the United States through several ports. Those from Europe generally came through East Coast facilities, while those from Asia generally entered through West Coast centers. More than 70% of all immigrants, however, entered through New York City, which came to be known as the Golden Door. Throughout the late 1800s, most immigrants arriving in New York entered at the Castle Garden Depot near the tip of Manhattan. In 1892, the federal government opened a new immigration processing center on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Many states, especially those with sparse populations, actively sought to attract immigrants by offering jobs or land for farming. Once settled, immigrants looked for work. There were never enough jobs, and employees often took advantage of the immigrants. Men were generally paid less than other workers, and women less than men. So, as you can see, women were working too. Once settled, immigrants looked for work. There were never enough jobs, and employers often took advantage of the immigrants. Men were generally paid less than other workers. The immigrant men were generally paid less than people who weren't immigrants, who weren't foreigners. Who were those people? Fill in the blank. And women were paid less than men, which means women work too. Okay? Many immigrants suffered verbal and physical abuse because they were different. Think about this. Think about this. These are people coming from Europe. 12 million, remember. Many immigrants suffered verbal and physical abuse because they were different. Different from who? And how were they different? Ask yourself these things, man. Think about that. I'm not going to get into it. I want people to think for themselves. I'm not doing the thinking for everybody. European immigrants. Okay? This is European immigrants. Where we at with it? Where we at with it right now? Okay. This is immigration to the United States. What is this? This is immigration to the United States.org. They got a whole website for. Okay. European immigrants. This is from 11/14/2011. The territory of the United States was originally settled in ancient times by the Asian ancestors of modern Native Americans. The territory of the United States. Listen, they didn't say America, right? Again, man, I'm not the people who have so graciously subscribed to my channel, and the people who have so graciously are watching this video in its entirety and have watched other shows that I've done in their entirety. See, these people understand that when we talk about the United States, especially during these times of the waves of pilgrims or settlers, that we are not necessarily speaking of the place we term as the United States today with the 50 states. We're not talking about America. We're not talking about necessarily the place from the top of Canada to the bottom of Argentina, encompassing all the islands and such. We talk about the United States, we talking about a portion of the Americas, okay? European immigrants. That's the title. This is the title for what I'm about to read. The territory of the United States was originally settled in ancient times by the Asian ancestors of modern Native Americans. This is European immigrants, immigration to the United States. And this is immigration to unitedstates.org. European immigrants. One more again. The territory of the United States was originally settled in ancient times by the Asian ancestors of modern Native Americans. The creation of European colonies in the Americas as expressions of political power and as business opportunities stimulated both forced and free migration from Europe. European immigration has been almost constant since the early 17th century. Transatlantic migration, transatlantic it says transatlantic migration. Think of the wordplay. They said in the previous one, transoceanic immigration. Transatlantic migration. It's transatlantic migration, not slave trading, migration. Can be seen as an extension of long-standing patterns of movement within Europe that stretch back to the Middle Ages. Migration within Europe was a necessary precursor to transatlantic migration. Studies of immigrants from the colonial period onward have indicated that a majority of individual European immigrants had some previous migration experience either regionally or within Europe prior to coming to North America. In a study of the British colonies in North America after the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, 1756 through 1763, Bernard Bailyn found that 1/3 of all immigrants to North America came from London or its surrounding counties, and 1/4 directly from London itself. Of these immigrants, many were relatively recent arrivals in the British capital city. 2/3 of these immigrants were Scots. 2/3 of these immigrants were Scots. That's why it's American and what they term as Black Americans and what is termed as Black Americans and what is termed as Black Scots. It's a kind of a little young family reunion, I guess, on social media, or has been in the recent past. Maybe this is why, because these possibly are your family members and you theirs. 2/3 of these immigrants were Scots, many of whom came as a result of political and economic disruptions in the Highland regions. Migration changed this view and opened up the possibility of expanding one's material universe and realizing economic possibilities that were previously unattainable. The process of European immigration to the New World is closely tied to economic and social changes in Europe that were well underway by the 18th century, the 1700s. In England, the process of enclosure took open land away from peasant tenant farmers, often to create pasture land for raising sheep, encouraged by the growth of the profitable wool trade. Although this movement began during the late medieval period, it accelerated during the 17th and 18th centuries. Dispossessed peasants were sometimes compensated with less desirable pieces of land, eminent domain. Does it sound familiar? Eminent domain, taxes, tributes. See? Then? But many migrated to cities or to rural areas to work as wage laborers. This is happening in Europe. This is happening, in England. The common saying was that England was a land where sheep eat men. In Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Germany, efforts to modernize farming had a similar effect that, coupled with wars and political upheaval, resulted in the growth of a class of landless or land poor people in need of wage labor. See, everywhere there are miserable people and there are blissful people. And it seems that the miserable people want you to share in their misery. Let's get into this. By the mid 18th century, the growth of European industrialization drew many out of the countryside and into factories. The same playbook. The same playbook. And guess what? You, me, our people, let it happen. Let it play out. Even participated to this day. Out of the countryside and into factories, mills, and mines. This process affected Western Europe most directly, but its indirect effects were felt throughout the continent. The usual method of peasant emancipation was to convert labor duties into cash rents, and, much like the earlier enclosure movement in England, to restrict peasant access to pastures, woodlands, or other resources once used in common. Oh my God, does this sound familiar? As one Polish scholar put it, peasant emancipation took the shackles off the peasants' feet and took the shoes as well. Damn. As one Polish scholar put it, peasant emancipation took the shackles off the peasants' feet and took the shoes as well. The result was a sudden need for money in village economies where cash had rarely been used. Frown your face, get mad, get upset. This is business. This impelled peasants to migrate in search of work, and as they did so, they found not only the ability to pay rents, but the possibility of bettering their economic status. An economic status that was once not necessary, that once didn't exist, but was now an illusion that had become reality. Wow. Those living close to industrial areas in Europe were usually attracted to those regions. Peasants living in more remote areas, however, were more likely to travel overseas, especially to the United States or the United Colonies. This was the result of a clear-sighted economic strategy and improving transportation technology, especially railroads and steamships. Over time, the speed of travel grew and its cost shrank, not only in the price of tickets, but also in the time and other expenses saved. This made the New World more attractive as a destination. Given the higher wages offered in America, the benefits of peasants traveling to America grew accordingly. It's one thing about doing these shows. This is sad stuff, man. This is sad stuff. But see, when you go breathe in the fresh air outside and you look at the trees and you put your hand on the tree and you look at the leaves and the sun shining on you and you looking at things grow and you looking at the hawks and the falcons and the vultures. And you smelling the pungent fragrance from the flowers that's growing. You realize that you can't live in sadness, that this soil don't belong to nobody. You was put here. You came from the womb of a woman just like everyone else did. You was brought here for a reason, and that reason is to live, not in sadness. Let's shake it. North America's abundance of resources and its relatively smaller and less densely concentrated population began attracting immigrants during the early 17th century. The people who were coming here, they were, for lack of a better term, sleepwalking, because they didn't realize just their very presence on this soil was identity theft. It was eclipsing the people. It was, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say invading. It was intrusive. It was crowding us. They was all right here, right next to you. Give me some room. Give me 50 feet. Throughout its history, average wages in the United States have always been higher than in Europe. Moreover, due to Indian removal policies and westward expansion during the 19th century, the United States offered an abundance of farmed grazing land that was both relatively inexpensive and highly productive. America attracted three main types of immigrants. The first are settler immigrants who came with the intention of settling permanently in the New World. They usually bring all or most of their immediate and extended family members and thus cut their strongest ties to their home villages. Historically, this pattern was often associated with those who came to America with the specific intention of taking up farms. Bringing additional family members was beneficial as an additional source of farm labor or slave labor, right? And I'm not saying it as it being a bad thing. No, words have meanings. Laborer, worker, employee, slave. The majority of settler immigrants from Europe during the 19th and early 20th centuries were from Northern and Western Europe. Says early significant arrivals were 1607 from those places. Labor seekers are the second type of immigrants, those who come to find jobs that pay good wages. Labor seeking immigrants have made up and continue to make up the largest numbers of immigrants to the United States. Typical labor seeking immigrants are men aged between 16 and 45 who come for unskilled or semi-skilled work. A significant number of women also come as labor-seeking immigrants. However, in most European immigrant streams, with the notable exception of Ireland, men have historically predominated. Labor-seeking immigrants may come for limited periods of time and then return. In the case of European immigrants, this has resulted in very high return rates from some countries. Among Southern Italian immigrants, return rates as high as 40% were not unknown. The largest groups of labor-seeking immigrants from Europe during the 19th and early 20th century, the 1800s and 1900s, were from Eastern and Southern Europe. And what is Eastern Europe? I guess that would be Russia, China, things of this nature, a bunch of more countries, a bunch of more places as well. And Southern Europe, which is what? Portugal, Spain, stuff like that, right? France, right? Refuge, a bunch of stuff too that I haven't named that, don't come to mind as easily as those do. I'm programmed too. I got to get over my programming. I'm breaking the programming as well. Smell me? Refugees or those fleeing some form of religious or political persecution constitute the third type of immigrants, of which there are probably none. The first significant European immigration to the New World came from the British Isles, with the first communities formed in New England during the 1620s. 1619 Project, Big Business Now. They tell us is when our ancestors got here, right? But you see what's going on in 1620. You see it. You see it. How you robbing and kidnapping and things like that in large numbers. And you ain't even standing 10 toes down yet. You ain't on your square. No, you ain't on your square yet. Right? You ain't got no paper. You working to pay your bus fare. In 1820, 8,385 European immigrants arrived in the United States. 10 years later, arrivals reached 23,322. During the 1840s and 1850, immigration numbers skyrocketed, reaching a peak of roughly 428,000 in 1855 alone. Therefore, poor economic conditions and the onset of the U.S. Civil War in 1861 again reduced European immigration dramatically. However, it never fell below 100,000 immigrants per year. Per year. And they tell you, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. My great grandparents came here with a quarter in their pocket. And now they own a business, they got a house, they got a farm. Why? If you go somewhere with a quarter in your pocket, what's going to happen? Where you going to eat at? Where you going to sleep at? How you going to get from point A to point B? How you going to buy yourself something? Where you going to use the bathroom at? How you going to buy yourself some tissue? How you going to wash up? You ain't going to get no haircut. Where you going to get some clothes at? Because it's getting cold outside. You going to be houseless, dwellingless, okay? You're going to starve. So all that stuff about people came here with a quarter in their pocket and all of a sudden they got this and they got that. Remember, however, it never fell below 100,000 immigrants per year. What was they doing? They was getting free room. They was getting free room, board, and food, room, and board. Food, shelter, and clothing. They was getting it all free. Land, too. I ain't blaming nobody. At some point, you got to take the blame. You got to take the responsibility. Immigration grew once more, peaking in 1866 and again in 1873 when arrivals again topped 400,000 per year. Here they go. Ellis Island was the primary port of entry. Remember, it was Galveston, Texas, too. Okay? It was Galveston, too. Texas, too. Don't forget that. But Ellis Island was the primary port of entry for European immigrants between 1892 and 1954. This picture is compliments of the Library of Congress. People coming over here. Take your stuff just like they do today. It ain't never stopped. Cast your vote, right? Because that matter, right? Stop. Because that matter. I think not. Beginning in the 1880s and continuing through the passage of restrictive immigration laws in 1924, the largest wave of immigration in history arrived on North America's shores. beginning in the 1880s and continuing through the passage of restrictive immigration laws in 1924. Along with the Racial Integrity Act in 1924, the largest wave of immigration in history arrived on North American shores. The largest number of arrivals came in the period from 1900 to 1914. Arrivals fell off sharply during World War I. Yeah, they ain't coming to no war zone. They ain't not trying to fight nobody. They just trying to come make some paper. The largest number of immigrants came in 1907 when approximately 1.3 million arrived during that year alone. Although immigrants continued to arrive from Western Europe and Scandinavia, this wave of immigration was dominated by East, Central, and Southern Europe. Beginning in the eastern marches of the German Empire, immigration fever spread eastward into Austria, Hungary, Romania, and the western regions of Russia. Italy also, and ain't it funny how when these people, all these different peoples come here, they get this bravado when we already know they being a patriot is a part of the contract that they get. They gotta be patriotic, but they get this bravado. You understand? Like they a different kind of human being when they get that, put that hyphen and they use America as they surnation. You understand? They get this bravado. They even want you to leave. It's time for you to go. I mean, it's your house and it's time for you to go when they get over here and put that hyphen behind their nation. They put that hyphen and then America as they surnation. It's time for you to go now. Beginning in the eastern marches of the German Empire, immigration fever spread eastward into Austria, Hungary, Romania, and the western regions of Russia. Italy also sent massive number of immigrants, and while many came from northern Italy, southern Italians and Sicilians dominated Italian arrivals. From East Central Europe, Poles, and then anyway. Poles were the largest single group arriving from the German, Russian, and Austrian Empire. Jews were a close second, although many came from Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Romania. Russian Jews formed the largest contingent. A host of smaller groups also came. Hungarians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians. What is that? Carpatho-Russians? Carpatho-Russians. I got to look that up. We got to see who they are. Who are those people? Slovaks, Czechs, Romanians, Slavans, Croatians, Serbs, Macedonians, Bulgarians, and Greeks. Sheesh. We don't got a chance, y'all. Whew. Sorry to say, man. We full. Ain't no more room. They gonna make some more room though, man. And then, they just talking about these people who you term as coming from the place that you term as Europe. What about the people who coming from the place that you term as Africa and Asia? We all know as one landmass, but what about those people? The people who you call yourself black, or people who look like us call themselves black, which don't exist. It redacts you from life. You're redacted from life. That's what you're saying. I'm redacted from life, and I'm proud of it. When you keep calling yourself black, and then people come here from that place or from other places who complexion resembles yours, and they also okay with being called black, guess what? It's easier to take your stuff because you give it away. There's no need to take it no more. You give it away. And see, it's a pride. You got a pride. Some of these people who term themselves black or African American, it's a pride that comes with giving your stuff away. Like, it's a bad thing to want to hold on to your stuff. It's people who came here a few hundred years ago who took your stuff and they holding on to the stuff they took from you to this day. And they don't feel bad about holding on to the stuff they took from you, because generations of their people have benefited from that stuff. Makes sense. In contrast to earlier waves of immigrants, the Europeans who came between 1880 and 1924 were predominantly labor-seeking immigrants. However, some did come within family units and some did settle on farms. It was primarily industrial work that drew them to the United States. And they settled in the areas of heaviest industrial activity. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest the Midwest and Great Lakes states. True indeed. Wage labor immigrants from East Central and Southern Europe provided the workforce for America's industry. Now, mind you, during the mid to late 1800s and early 1900s, we saw a ton of our people who are falsely called Black Americans or African Americans, but properly Americans, the only Americans there ever was, is, and will be the American Indians, or more specifically, what your people called you specifically and what your people called themselves before somebody else started calling them Negro, colored, black, mulatto, all octoroon, quadroon, all these terms. Okay. We know that our people, there was a ton of inventions being made during the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, as well as there were a ton of our people with these historically so-called black universities and colleges during the same period. So when it says wage labor immigrants from the East Central and Southern Europe provided the workforce for America's industry, and by the turn of the century dominated both heavy and light industry in most sectors, who are the people responsible for the inventions that those industries were producing? Come on, I don't got too long. We just putting together, we just peeling back layers. We peeling back layers. That's why these shows go on for as long as they do, because we peeling back layers. Can't rush through this stuff. And by the turn of the century dominated both heavy and light industry in most sectors. So by the turn of the industry, they were the most of the workers, laborers, employees, slaves, right? Not a bad thing. I'm just saying what it is. I mean, some of these words, people got such a romantic, intimate relationship with some of these words, they never take the time to think about what do these words mean? Jews and Italians were prominent in the needle trades. Poles, Italians, Slovaks, Ukrainians, and Hungarians dominated coal mining and steel making. Poles were the largest group in auto manufacturing, and Poles and Lithuanians predominated in meat packing. Finns and Southern Slavs were the largest groups in copper and other hard rock mining. The prominence of these groups made them a significant force in the industrial labor movement of the 1930s. The success of the Congress of Industrial Organization and the United Auto Workers depended on the support of immigrant workers and their second generation children. It went into them being dependent on these people after a while. Not saying that these people should not have been taken care of, because they should have been. They can write their own ticket if they're the majority of the people who are actually putting in the work to realize these industries. Where was your people? They was right there. They was right there. Don't be fooled. Your people was right there. Don't Your people was the ones who was doing it first. Your people were the ones who was doing these things. It's just that these people were coming looking for work, willing to provide that work for less. But it was more than they were making where they came from. We won't get all into that because that's natural sense kind of stuff. Between World War II and the reform of U.S. immigration laws in 1965, the United States admitted between 2 and 3 million European immigrants. Following the major reform of U.S. immigration laws in 1965, a steady flow of immigration from Europe developed. Some traditional sending countries continue to provide large numbers of immigrants. Sheesh. Following the fall of Eastern Europe's communist governments during the last decade of the 20th century and the wars and ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, a large number of Russians, Jews, Ukrainians, and Poles, as well as Romanians and Bosnians, arrived in the United States. I'm thinking every type of person on the planet is coming over here. Why is this so easy? Why do people come here so much? I'm not hearing of us going to other places in these type of numbers. Of course we go to other places. Of course the Americans go to other places. We got all these people who calling themselves Americans. Why? I don't know. Why would you want to call yourself something you not? Why would you want to take someone else's identity and keep it as your own? Because we don't call ourselves nothing but who we is. We know we Americans, and that's what we call ourselves, right? But I guess we do have a large portion of our population that call themselves things that don't really exist, like Black and African Americans. So I do understand propaganda seems to have been king for a long time. European immigrants has continued into the first day, but we can't keep blaming propaganda for this now. We all adults. We got to take responsibility. If you walking around here committing identity theft, then it's your fault. If you around here and know somebody committing identity theft and you don't tell them and you scared to tell them and in conversation that you have with people, then it's your fault. European immigration has continued into the first decade of the 21st century. 21st century, 2000s, the 2000s, when Europeans were still making up between 15 and 20% of the immigrants admitted to the United States. This pattern appeared likely to continue into the foreseeable future. Now you know why they always claiming that they the majority. Because when they talk about the percentage of white Americans, you have to understand there are many peoples from around the world that identify as white on the census. This particular article, John Radzilowski, and it says further reading on what we just went through is right here. You can look at that and do some further reading if reading is your thing. This is from The Root. The Root. More Africans immigrated to the U.S. in the 2000s than came by slave ship. Just the title alone. I mean, come on, then. It's from The Roots. It's from the root. Now, I've already looked at this, but even before I read this article, when I read that the name of the website or the name of the publication was The Root, and then I saw, when I saw that it was The Root, I said, okay, the name of the person that's is gonna do this article is this person is gonna have a name that is from someone who would be termed African. I'm just guessed. More Africans immigrated to the U.S. and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, it's just observations. More Africans immigrated to the U.S. in the 2000s than came by slave ship. Come on, man. More immigrated in the 2000s than came by slave ship. Now, the whole slave ship thing, we're not going to go over it. If you've watched any of my other shows, I got a few other shows on this channel. Go watch them, because by the time you get up to this particular show, you'll know about the whole slave ship and all that kind of stuff. You'll have other information that will give you the fuel to come up with what you think about all of it. More Africans immigrated to the U.S. in the 2000s than came by slave ship. According to a New York Times report, more black Africans moved to the U.S. between 2000 and 2010 than were brought to the North American continent by slave ship. By Diana Ozimahoya, Ozimabahoya, Ozimabahoya, Eramosili. Diana, that's the American part, right? Ozimabahoya, Eramosili. Published September 30th, 2014. According to a New York Times report, more black Africans moved to the U.S. between 2000 and 2010 than were brought to the North American continent by slave ship during the 3 centuries long Atlantic slave trade. Yep. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of legal black African immigrants, that's a lot, legal black African immigrants in the United States about doubled to around 1 million, the Times reports. During that single decade, according to the most reliable estimates, more black Africans arrived in this country on their own than were imported directly to North America during the more than 3 centuries of the slave trade. Let that sink in. The report explains how they're usually cherry-picked by American embassies, which screen for certain qualifications so that the immigrants can hit the ground running when they get here. They want you to hit the ground running too, but in a different way. They're a self-selected population, Kim Nichols, an executive with the African Services Committee, explained. Kim Nichols, maybe that's a sister who works for the African Services Committee, meaning it's a sister, you feel me, working with the people or for the people who will ultimately come here and get your stuff and get her stuff too. Anyway, I don't know who Kim Nichols is, but anyway, let's move on. Ghana Business News. Over 500 million people in Africa can't prove their identity. World Bank. On September 26, 2018, about 1 billion people around the world are unable to prove their identity, with over half living in Africa. So, wait a minute. Let's go back. Let's go back. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of legal black African immigrants in the United States about doubled to around 1 million, the Times reports. During that single decade, according to the most reliable estimates, more black Africans arrived in this country on their own than were imported directly to North America during the more than 3-century slave trade, where it is said, you come from, where it is said that our people originate from. It said that the people who came during the 3-century slave trade are our ancestors. And they know that, okay? It is known, right? This is what you're told. This is what's put into your brain. But then we see over 500 million people in Africa can't prove their identity. World Bank. So how do they know these are your ancestors when a lot of people can't prove their own identity? About 1 billion people around the world are unable to prove their identity, with over half living in Africa. The World Bank's Identification for Development Initiative estimates Identification for Development is an initiative by the World Bank Group that helps countries realize the transformational potential of digital identification. We see why they're putting out this article. We see the ulterior motive, but what I'm more interested is in half of the 1 billion invisible people without a formal identity are in Africa. No ID, this is the motive. No ID means no access to health, education, social protection, and other vital services. Yeah. Of course, the goal is to put people under a microscope. We understand that. But what we're saying is that half of the 1 billion invisible people without a formal identity are in Africa. No ID means no access to health, education, social protection, and other vital services, says Kristalina Georgieva, World Bank CEO and co-chair of the ID4D. ID4D. What? ID4D? Listen, man, we got kids watching this show. We got shorties watching this show probably. We can't have no ID for D. High Level Advisory Council. We must work together to create inclusive and trusted digital ID systems that can unlock economic opportunities for the world's most vulnerable people. See, this lady, Kristalina Georgieva, World Bank CEO, she loved you so much that she eventually gonna make these people have an ID. Yeah, she's a demon. To address the problem, African leaders, the World Bank Group, the United Nations, and other development partners have met on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly for the African Leaders Roundtable on Identification for Development to catalyze collective action, boost financial support, and harness innovation for the digital identification and civil registration agenda in Africa. More from the agenda. The World Bank Group estimates it will take $6 billion to meet Africa's digital identification and civil registration needs. Nearly $1 billion is being mobilized for digital identification and civil registration projects across 30 countries, 23 of which are in Africa. Mommy Africa. Digital identification can play an important role in achieving the sustainable development goals. It can enable the world's poorest and most vulnerable people to gain access to critical services, from education to healthcare and financing, while also advancing their legal and political rights, said Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and co-chair of the ID4D High Level Advisory Council, at the roundtable discussion. More demons. Okay. Let's keep it pushing. Let's keep it pushing. Let's get away from them. We don't do ID for D. You know what I mean? We don't do the ID for D. AI overview. This is a little help from the software. We ask the software a question. AI overview. In the 1870 US Census, the W next to, you'll learn that in these censuses, the 1870 census, this census, whatever, they have race or color designations. In the 1870, I believe it was just white, black, or white, black, and mulatto, or white, Negro, and mulatto. Regardless, it's not many. I mean, Indian, Chinese, or something like that. But check this out. And see, of course, you all know that the software, when asked the question, it pulls from the available sources that it has online, or what available sources were programmed into the software as being available to the software, right? So what I've noticed is that whenever I ask a question, the sources that I'm given are fairly new sources, meaning there are no 1671 books from 1671 or 1730 or 1859. Rarely. There probably never are when I ask the software questions. Just take that into consideration. In the 1870 US Census, the W next, because I'm knee deep in the genealogy, have been for some years, a few years now. And I noticed that these color designations or race designations change on people from year to year. So I want to know better what is meant by them. In the 1870 U.S. Census, the W next to an American Indian person's name indicated that they were recorded as white despite their native heritage. This was done for individuals who had assimilated into white society and were considered to be living like white people. Think about that. In the this right here. This is a response, an answer to a question that I asked. I may read some more of these where you actually get a chance to, I can tell you the question that I asked. But right here, obviously, I don't see the question that I asked, but you have an idea of what it was. In the 1870 U.S. Census, the W next to an American Indian person's name indicated that they were recorded as white. Think about this. The W next to an American Indian. So if I'm on the census, me, and there's a W next to my name, that's a W next to an American Indian's name, an American Indian's name, right? And you wonder, how can a W be next to somebody who look like me name? In the 1870 U.S. Census, the W next to an American Indian person's name indicated that they were recorded as white despite their Native American heritage. No. Despite their American Indian heritage or their American heritage, or whatever your family calls you. We're talking more broad right now. This was done for individuals who had assimilated into white society, whatever that is, and were considered to be living like white people, with a 6-piece suit on. The census also included options for black, mulatto, Chinese, and Indian, labeled as I. Here's a more detailed explanation. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, a societal shift where individuals of Native American descent who had adopted white customs and lifestyles were sometimes recorded as white. Individuals who were recorded as white were those who had assimilated and adopted white ways, according to historical context. Check it out. The census did not include Indian Territory, present day Oklahoma, which was largely inhabited by Native American tribes at the time. The census did not include Indian Territory, present day Oklahoma, which was largely inhabited by Native American tribes at the time. Why didn't it include present day Oklahoma, which was the hub of the Native Americans? And I put the census did not include Indian Territory. It says present day Oklahoma, which was largely inhabited by Native American tribes. You know, Trail of Tears and all that, Native Americans, that's their hub. And I put cut because I wanted to go here. Look, if y'all can see this, Indian Territory, Oklahoma, right here. You see it, and you see where it's these lines. It says the red line is the Seminoles. They coming from Florida or whatever. Let's not talk about what these groups are. Let's not talk about that. We know these the 5 civilized tribes, right? This designation, it makes me not even really care for the word tribe no more. I really don't even like the word no more. Just like family and all that. We deal with our peoples, right? Check it out. Indian Territory. You see Fort Gibson, Fort Coffee, Fort Smith, Fort Towson, all in Indian Territory, right? Right? Check it out. Oklahoma, Indian Territory. Remember what they said? I don't want y'all to forget. The census did not include Indian Territory, present day Oklahoma, which was largely inhabited by by Native American tribes, right? That's Indian Territory, right? And look, it say red is the Seminole, yellow is the Creek coming from Alabama and Georgia, but they coming from Fort Mitchell in Alabama and Georgia, right? Both it's coming from the Creek coming from Fort Mitchell in Alabama and Georgia, right? And then they got the blue is Cherokee. They coming from right here in Georgia, and they going to Indian Territory. This the Indian Removal Act. They removing them. They making them go home. Go. You live over here now. Get up out of here. It's a new. We here now. You can't live here no more. You understand? We own you. We telling you to go over here. You got the Choctaw, not we hear the Chickasaw, the purple right here. They coming from upper northern Mississippi, the Chickasaw, not the Chickasha. You know what I'm saying? You got the Choctaw in the green coming from Mississippi over here, not the Choctaw. You know what I mean? And you see all of them going over here to Indian Territory. But wait. Did you see this? Listen, all the green is Indian lands before relocation. Relocation was what? What year was relocation? 1870 something? Give or take? 18, right, give or take? Relocation 1870 something, give or take. Now that's the Indian Territory. It should be called Native American territory, or it should be called U.S. federal territory, right? Because that's what they move into. They say Indian Territory, but is it really Indian Territory? It's Native American territory. And I mean, do they really own it? I don't know, right? But check this out. Look at the green. And in the legend, the green is Indian lands before relocation. And it just so happens that a lot of our people is where this green is at, right? I know a lot of y'all people from Texas too, and all these other places, California and all this stuff. But look, a lot of my people, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Virginia, all this is green. It say Indian lands before relocation. Now check this out. You think all these people that was in Indian lands and who considered Indians You think all them people moved to this little portion that they call Indian territory, which is really Native American territory? And look what the marches and the people coming from. They coming from specific places within these states, within these places, specific little places. They not coming from, it's not showing you that the entire state of Georgia is blue and it's moving to Indian territory. No, it's a small portion. So where the rest of these millions and millions of people at? They right there. They at the crib. They ain't go nowhere, man. Come on, man. Be for real, man. In the 1870 U.S. Census, B for the race of an American Indian typically means black. See, I worded the question in such a way where if I'm on the census, right? Just like with the W, if I'm on the census and they put a B by my name, I'm an Indian, I'm American Indian, I'm on the census, they put a B by my name. Why would they do that? It say, in the 1870 U.S. Census, B for the race of an American Indian typically means black. There are some cases where individuals of mixed heritage might be coded as I for Indian or W for white, but B generally denoted black according to the National Archives. Now, what black mean? You tell me. Okay, here we go. In the 1870 U.S. Census, the abbreviation B alongside a person's name indicates that they were classified as black. The B designation was used regardless of whether the individual had any other ancestry or not. Listen to what I'm saying. Rewind if you need to go over it again. Because I'm telling you, you pose these questions right and you get a bang for your buck. You hear me? In terms of the answer. And they also list the sources where they got these answers from. I'm not going to go through those sources. I may go through one or two, but I'm not going to go through those. I just want you to see how interesting this is. In the 1870 U.S. Census, the B designation for race was used to categorize individuals identified as black, encompassing those with full-blooded African ancestry, even though the concept of race is socially constructed and not based on skin color. Socially constructed. Right? Are you a social justice warrior? The 1870 census also included mulatto to categorize individuals with mixed race ancestry, reflecting the social context of the time, and the one-drop rule, which considered anyone with any African ancestry as black. The concept of race is not a biological reality, but rather a social construct. The concept of race is not a biological reality, but rather a social construct. I think many people know this. I just think people are insane. Some people are just insane, man. Call it what it is. Some people are insane. It's important to remember that the census classifications did not solely rely on physical appearance, skin color. The U.S. Census categories for race have evolved over time, reflecting changes in social understanding and legal definitions of race. Here is the question. Let's go. If Africans didn't come to America, see, when they say African, having any African blood, you were classified as black. I'm saying it's hard to let that ride. You know what I mean? It's hard to let that ride. We got to get into that. This is the question that I asked. If Africans didn't come to America in any substantial numbers until the 1990s, remember what we just went over earlier in the show? If Africans didn't come to America in any substantial numbers until the 1990s, then why in the 1870 U.S. Census is the B race category directly associated with an individual with African ancestry, even though Africans were not in America in any substantial numbers? What is the software going to share with us? The premise of the question is inaccurate. Yeah, it's inaccurate, right? People of African descent were present in the United States in substantial numbers long before the 1990s. Their presence in the U.S. dates back to the 16th and 17th centuries during the transatlantic slave trade. By 1775, Africans made up 20% of the population in the American colonies. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States. See? 1775 Africans. Listen to these people. I mean, listen to the software. Listen to what they've gathered from the sources and what we're being programmed and indoctrinated with. Their presence in the U.S. dates back to the 16th and 17th century during the transatlantic slave trade. Y'all remember what we just went through? We ain't finna go through it again. It's too much. By 1775, Africans made up 20% of the population in the American colonies. American colonies, U.S. colonies, United colonies. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there were nearly 4 million enslaved, drumroll, people. Doesn't say Africans, doesn't say Europe. It says people in the U.S., the United colonies. The 1870 census, taken shortly after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, naturally included a significant population of individuals with African ancestry, according to Family Search. Remember the B designation. Any trace of African blood and you are considered black. Significant population of individuals with African ancestry, according to Family Search. Okay, the U.S. Census Bureau did categorize people with African ancestry as mulatto. Why would they do that? In the 1870 census, which was defined as anyone with any perceptible trace of African blood. What does that mean? You explain it to me. This categorization was not based on recent immigration from Africa. But rather on the long established presence of people of African descent, largely due to the legacy of slavery in the country. They playing with you right now with this. They playing. AI overview. Yes, by 1775, Africans primarily enslaved, but also free. By 1775, Africans primarily enslaved, but also free, constituted approximately 20% of the population within the 13 British colonies located along the east coast of North America. I'm sure my question had something to do with, okay, in 1775, what was considered the U.S., okay? In reference to the previous page, 20%. They said 20%. Yes, by the 1775, Africans primarily enslaved, but also free, constituted about approximately 20% of the population within the 13 British colonies located along the east coast of North America. Can you dig? You dig? You dig? However, this population was not evenly distributed across all 13 colonies. The majority of Africans, around 90%, resided in the southern colonies. Southern colonies. You understand what that means. That's not talking about Louisiana. That's talking about the southern colonies of the 13 colonies. Virginia was considered, I believe, a southern colony. of the 13 colonies. The majority of Africans, around 90%, resided in the southern colonies, where their labor was essential to the agrarian economy, particularly for growing crops like tobacco and rice. In fact, in South Carolina and Georgia, it's funny they mentioned rice, and then South Carolina, 3 rices indigenous to that place. Okay. In Georgia, Africans formed a majority of the population by this time. In contrast, the enslaved population in New England accounted for less than 5% of the total population, according to the American Battlefield Trust. While slave owning households might have only had a few enslaved people, cities like Newport, Rhode Island saw enslaved populations closer to 20%. In the mid-Atlantic colonies such as Virginia, enslaved enslaved people constituted a larger proportion of the population, nearly 50% by the mid-18th century, notes the American Battlefield Trust. In 1775, the population of the 13 British colonies was approximately 2.5 million, with roughly 500,000 enslaved and free Africans. Enslaved and free Africans. This means that on average, each colony would have had around 192,000 people. But the actual population varied significantly between colonies. Listen to all that I say. I'm trying to cover it. I'm trying to stay on the software's heels. I'm staying on the software's heels. Question. We are fortunate to have the question that I asked. If in 1775 the population of the 13 British colonies was approximately 2.5 million, with roughly 500,000 enslaved and free Africans, this means that on average each colony would have had around 192,307 people, but the actual population varied significantly between colonies. Of the preceding statement, if the preceding statement is true, then what year did the majority of these settlers arrive to the colonies? How did the settlers get to the colonies? What countries did the Africans who were enslaved come from? What were the demographics of the ethnicities of the settlers of the British colonies? While the initial English settlements began in the early 1600s, with colonies like Jamestown 1607 and Plymouth 1620, a massive population boom occurred in the 1700s. Between 1700 and 1775, the population of the colonies increased tenfold, from approximately 250,000 to 2.5 million. This period likely saw the majority of the overall population arrive or be born in the colonies. European colonists, particularly those from Britain, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean by ship to reach the east coast of North America. Many early settlers, particularly to Chesapeake Bay colonies, arrived as indentured servants, working for a period of time to pay for their passage. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought across the Atlantic by traders, primarily from West Africa and West Central Africa. This brutal system brought an estimated 278,000 enslaved Africans to the colonies between 1607 and 1775. Remember, it is said that in 1619, the first 20 and odd Africans arrived. And it is also said that in 1620, the Pilgrims arrived, right? In Plymouth. This brutal system brought an estimated 278,000 enslaved Africans to the colonies between 1607 and 1775. So if they're speaking about 1607 Africans coming here, and they said 278,000 enslaved Africans to the colonies between 1607 and 1775, and the first ones, the 20 and odd first ones, came here in 1619, why would they even mention anything before 1619 if if the first 20 and odd came in 1619, why would you even mention from 1607 to 1619? Let's shake it. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to the British colonies originated from West and West Central Africa. These regions included Senegambia, Upper Guinea, including Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, including Congo and Angola. By 1776, the largest group of European ancestry were the English, followed by Scots, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, German, Dutch, French, and other smaller groups. By 1775, approximately 20%, there go that number again, 20% of the colonial population were African Americans. Whoa, whoa, whoa. A significant portion of whom were enslaved. Whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Wait a minute. See that? By 1775, approximately 20% of the colonial population were African Americans, a significant portion of whom were enslaved. What does enslaved mean? It means they're working for someone. By 1775, approximately that 20% of the colonial population were African Americans. It didn't say Africans. And it didn't say Africans for a reason. A significant portion of whom were enslaved, African Americans. There is no such thing as an African American in 1775. So who are the people? Who are the 20% of the colonial population? Huh? Is it your ancestors or ancestors of the people who they term as African American or Black Americans falsely, but really the indigenous Americans, the American Indians, us? That's who. Us. That's who. Was it your relatives? Was it your ancestors? Because there was no such thing as African Americans in 1775. None of your people was calling themselves African Americans in 1775, and nobody was known as that. Stop playing. While New England was relatively homogeneous, with a large concentration of English settlers, the middle colonies and southern colonies displayed greater ethnic and religious diversity, including German, Dutch, French, and other European groups. This is another question that I posed. What was the route used to bring Africans to America as slaves? The journey used to forcibly transport Africans to the Americas as slaves is known as the Middle Passage, a leg of the triangular trade route. This route involved 3 stages. See? You see how they listen, man. Yeah. I have to agree. This AI is fantastic, okay? This AI is really this AI is really giving like human vibes. You see the way the AI gets slick. You see the way the software gets slick on you. It don't answer the question. See how it's moving around, getting around the question? I just asked a simple question. What was the route used to bring Africans to America as slaves? Look what the software say. Look what, this ain't just the compiled sources, the information that's within the compiled sources that the software has access to, that's programmed within the software to have access to. Nah, there's something slick. This most slick right here. Say the journey used to forcibly transport Africans. This is some diplomatic. You know what I mean? Like some they giving me a political type answer. The journey used to forcibly transport Africans to the Americas as slaves is known as the Middle Passage, a leg of the triangular trade route. Let's see if we can get an answer. Still ain't got one. This route involved 3 stages: Europe to Africa. Okay. European ships laden with goods like iron, textiles, firearms, and brandy would sail to the west coast of Africa. Okay. So from Europe to Africa. Okay. Africa to the Americas. The Middle Passage. In Africa, European traders would exchange their goods for captured Africans. The enslaved people were then packed into ships and endured the horrific journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. So I'm guessing that they're saying that the route was across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. Now, they didn't get specific. Americas to Europe. Now, this is another. They answering something that I didn't ask them. In the Americas, the enslaved Africans were sold to plantation owners. The ships were then loaded with goods produced by enslaved labor, such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, to be transported back to Europe. I don't know. If you think the question got answered, then let me know. If not, let me know. It didn't really answer my question. It say AI responses may include mistakes. Of course, it's a computer. Got to on and off switch. It say, did you mean, and this was my question, can a small schooner successfully cross the Atlantic Ocean in the year 1700? And the software answered, yes. A schooner, even a relatively small one, could have successfully crossed the Atlantic in 1700. Schooners were used for coastal trade, and were perfectly capable of ocean crossings. The 62-ton schooner Quiero made a successful crossing in 1775, taking 28 days. You see, they named one crossing. The 62-ton schooner Quiero made a successful crossing in 1775, taking 28 days, taking almost a month in 1775. They said made a successful crossing. That's one. Crossing the Atlantic in a sailing ship in the 1700s was a long and difficult journey, often taking at least 6 weeks and sometimes longer, depending on weather conditions. The voyages were dangerous due to disease, storms, piracy, and difficult conditions, particularly in steerage. However, such journeys were undertaken regularly and were often successful, according to Constitution Facts and Europeana. Listen, I don't even want to think about what these men was doing on them ships, and I definitely hope there were no women traveling with them. The phrase slave ships is in quotations in the statement. I guess it was in quotations in the statement. Hold on, let me see if in one of the things that they said they had slave ships. I guess one of the replies, one of the answers they gave me had slave ships on it, and it was in quotations, and it says, and I asked about that. The phrase slave ships is in quotations in the statement because while they were specifically built or adapted for the purpose of transporting enslaved people, they were not considered legitimate vessels in the eyes of international law or morality. The term slave ship highlights the horrific nature of the Middle Passage and the dehumanization of those forced onto these voyages. See, the software, this is amazing. The way the software answers your question is it plays to the socially accepted way of today. It plays to trying to appeal to your emotions today. It's 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 an amazing thing. It's actually an amazing thing. I'm not just saying amazing. I know people use amazing all crazy to where they say amazing so much that there is nothing that's amazing because people use amazing so much. How can everything be amazing? But look, it says it says the term slave ship, it says the phrase slave ships is in quotations because that struck me as interesting that they had put the word slave ships in quotations in the statement, because while they were specifically built or adapted for the purpose of transporting enslaved people, they were not considered legitimate vessels in the eyes of international law or morality. And I underlined legitimate because we're going to go back to that. Okay, the term slave ship highlights the horrific. Now they're trying to pull at your heartstrings. Highlights the horrific nature of the Middle Passage and the dehumanization of those forced onto these voyages. So they said legitimate. Okay, check it out. In the statement, you provided the term legitimate refers to the idea that something is considered rightful, justified, and in accordance with established principles, whether legal or moral. Okay, this is my question. This is what I wrote. In the context of the slave trade, it means that slave ships were not considered to be operating within the bounds of proper or morally acceptable activity, despite the fact that merchants had adapted or built ships specifically for the slave trade. And the software says, here's why legitimate is used in this statement. The statement implies a broader, more enlightened view of international law that condemns the practice of transporting and enslaving human beings. Here is my question. In the statement you provided, the term legitimate refers to the idea that something is considered rightfully justified and in accordance with established principles, whether legal or moral. In the context of the slave trade, it means the slave ships were not considered to be operating within the bounds of proper or morally accepted activity, despite the fact that merchants had adapted or built ships specifically for the slave trade. Who specifically built said slave ships is what I asked. The AI, or the software, responds. Multiple sources indicate that slave ships were built and retrofitted by and understand these answers do have links to sources on them. Multiple sources indicate that slave ships were built and retrofitted by various individuals and businesses in both Europe and the Americas. In Europe, shipbuilders in cities like Bristol, UK, were actively involved in constructing and adapting vessels for this purpose. Examples of individual shipbuilders include James Hillhouse, who ran a shipyard in Bristol in the early 18th century and invested in slaving voyages. He ran it in the 1700s and invested in slaving voyages. There are no specifics into which specific voyages, okay? Sydenham Teast. And you think Sydenham Teast, these people probably came over here, people who had names like this, who were from places such as Sydenham Teast is from, and you think Tasha Washington name come from somebody from somewhere else. Sydenham Teast, who ran a shipyard on Wapping Wharf in Bristol and also invested in slave voyages. Which ones? What years? Names of ships and buyers, please. Sending ships to Africa specifically to trade for timber to be used in shipbuilding. Okay, we got Brock Banks Shipyard in Lancaster, England, which built a large number of ships, some of which were used in the slave trade. Which ones? What are the names? according to Facing the Past. What is Facing the Past? Engage their sources is the homework. In the Americas, particularly in New England and American South, ships were also built or retrofitted to engage in the slave trade. Rufus Soule, a shipbuilder in Freeport, Maine, built the bark Chieftain, which is, dig it, suspected of engaging in multiple transatlantic slave voyages. Merchants and shipyards in areas like Salem, Massachusetts, and Cape Ann were involved in building and refitting schooners and other vessels for the illegal slave trade after 1808. Was this the transatlantic trade or some other human traffic illegal trade after 1808? Doesn't say. The U.S. Navy at various locations, such as the Pensacola Navy Yard, also utilized the labor of enslaved people. Who were these people? Race, perhaps, to cut timber and construct ships. Very vague, very vague. And of course, like I said, they are all recent sources. AI overview. At the time of the 1860 U.S. Census, the population of Kentucky included a significant number of individuals categorized as white, reflecting the demographics of the state at the time. In 1860, Kentucky's population included 919,000 white people, 225,000 slaves, and 10,684 free black people. This breakdown indicates that white individuals comprise the largest portion of the state's population. 1860, there was a large amount of my family members in Kentucky. Yeah, Kentucky. I know quite a bit about Kentucky. My people was heavy in Kentucky. Some of my people. The U.S. Census has a long history. You know, actually, one of my grandmother's fathers, one of my great grandfathers, heavy in Kentucky, man. Ill people, man. Ill people. The U.S. Census has a long history of categorizing people based on race, with the primary categories being white and black for most of its existence. The 1860 census specifically lists individuals' names, age, sex, color, white, black, or mulatto, place of birth, and other information according to the National Archives. The categorization as white in the 1860 census and subsequent censuses encompass individuals of European descent as defined by the Census Bureau. While the term European settlers might conjure images of recent arrivals, the white population in Kentucky at that time included individuals whose families had been established in the state for generations, originating from various European backgrounds, according to Family Search. Okay, AI overview. Again, they're replying to one of my inquiries. The Treaty of 1866 for American Indians, specifically referring to the Reconstruction treaties with the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Remember, we went over that. Primarily focused on the status of freedmen, formerly enslaved people of African descent. Freedmen. See, you thinking too much. Freedmen? Free men? Come on, man. Free men. How many of y'all can walk out and say, hey, I'm a free man, I'm a free woman? Okay. Looking too deep into it. And required the tribes to abolish slavery and grant them citizenship. It also involved land cessions to the United States. Here's a more detailed breakdown. Freedmen provisions. The treaties with the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole nations included clauses addressing the rights of freedmen. Free men. These provisions free men. These provisions generally mandated that formerly enslaved people and their descendants be treated as citizens of the respective tribes with rights and privileges similar to those of native-born members. The treaties explicitly required the tribes to abolish slavery within their nations. The treaties also resulted in the tribes ceding portions of their land to the U.S. government, which was then used to settle other tribes and for other purposes. The treaties had a lasting impact with ongoing legal and political debates surrounding the citizenship status of freedmen, free men, free women, and their descendants within the tribes. These treaties remain binding on the tribes. The treaty with the Seminoles included stipulations regarding the rights of people of African descent within the tribe. Don't even sound right. African. Why is African the word right there? Where does it fit? The Cherokee Nation's 1866 treaty, the Treaty of Washington, included a provision that free men and their descendants would have all the rights of native Cherokees. The Muskogee Creek Nation Treaty is a key element in their argument for expanding tribal jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. And if you notice, I'm just going over these things with you. I'm hoping that there is someone out there who will use the opportunity to leave a comment that not only teaches me, but teaches all those who would watch this show something. Okay? I want to learn something from from what I just went over. The last few paragraphs that I went over. I want to learn something from those paragraphs. I'm going to keep my commentary to myself about those. In 1860, remember, 1860 is what we're talking about here. The vast majority of Native American tribes in Alabama included those who had traditionally lived in, listen, 1860, my people was heavy in Alabama, okay? Heavy. It's almost like we owned Greene County, Alabama. It's almost like it was ours. But see, we don't come from people who say they own soil. You know? Why would you say you own earth? Why would you say you own something that you didn't make? And even if you did make it, why would you say you own it? Because everything it took for you to make it was provided to you by earth. Check. The reason encompassing Bo-Liggy, and the reason I put a focus on Bo-Liggy is because one of my bloodlines come from Bo-Liggy. And then on a older map, it's called Bowlegger Swamp. And then on an older map, even of that, it's called Bugtoogaloo. In the region encompassing Bo-Liggy, Greene County, Alabama, had already been forcibly removed from their lands due to the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and subsequent treaties and actions. It say in 1860, the vast majority of Native American tribes in Alabama, including those who had traditionally lived in the region encompassing Bo-Liggy or Bowlegger Swamp or Bugtoogaloo, Greene County, had already been forcibly removed from their lands due to the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and subsequent treaties and actions. Yes. So why was my people still there in large numbers? See? The software say the vast majority of Native Americans, right? They ain't say nothing about the real Americans, the only Americans that ever was, is, and will be, the American Indians. They ain't say nothing about them niggas that was there because they stayed there. They ain't never went nowhere. The primary Native American tribes that had resided in Alabama area before their removal included Cherokee, Choctaw, Creeksaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Alabama, Cochitites, Uchis. These groups faced land assaults, warfare, disease, exploitation of resources, and forced relocation as European American settlers moved into the Southeast. By the 1830s, you know, them settlers were moving into the Southeast. Some of them, not all of them. You understand me? If you got a family and all the young ones then grew up, they adults now. All the men, they moving around different places in the country, different places in the state or whatever. And then you get some settlers who want to take advantage of somebody, maybe an older woman, an older man. They want to take advantage of them. They want what they got. See where I'm going with this? In some cases, we can't blame everybody. By the 1830s, the forced removal of these tribes, including the Creeks, who had historically occupied the area where Boligee, Greene County, is located, was largely complete. Therefore, while these tribes were historically present in the region, in 1860 their presence in Boligee, Greene County would have been negligible, with only a small number of scattered individuals or families remaining. That's because, drum roll, they redacted us. They redacted us in life. They blacked us out. If the preceding statement is true, check it out. Listen to what I say. If the preceding statement is true, then what were the American Indians called that didn't leave Boligee, Greene County, Alabama during the Indian removal? Right. If a small number of scattered Native American individuals, I didn't ask about Native American software. No. I asked about American Indians. See how the software be trying to be slick. If a small number of scattered Native American individuals or families remained in Boligee, Greene County, Alabama, Dada was born after the Indian removal, they wouldn't have a specific name different from their original tribal affiliations. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 aimed to forcibly relocate most Native American tribes from the southeast, including the Creeks, who inhabited the area around Boligee, to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Some individuals and families managed to evade removal through various means, including hiding out in remote areas or by negotiating with the U.S. government as friendly sticks. According to the Alabama Public Television. These individuals, Alabama Public Television, come on, man, that's the source for that. These individuals, while remaining in their ancestral lands, would still identify as members of their respective tribes, such as Creek or Choctaw. Yes. Do the right thing.